Wechamar, shwi area crossroads. Artenia Shunla, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Walk the Crossroads. This is your host here, Padraig OC, aka Shadowed Sin, and on this episode we'll be discussing the Imperial Avalonic Society, or the central societal norms and structure of the Triad, the trinary system that is at the heart of the story and game known as Tair Shah Serana, or the Land in the Stars. Now, the central aspect of this lore that we'll be discussing tonight is a document known as the Kimdoth Teortir, which was written by Empress Gwyn och Archer, the first emperor or empress of the Archer dynasty, the third of the imperial dynasties, and was later implemented by her daughter, Blodwyn och Archer, after she escaped the clutches of her rivals known as the Throne Cabal. Now, this document itself is sort of a constitutional bit, or a bit like Magna Carta. It establishes the rights, restrictions, and the general organization of how society and the empire today works. In many contexts, this was done to control the wars that were occurring primarily between the various religions. And this was causing a upheaval of not only power, but also made it very confusing for the noble houses to determine who had right of rule, who had power in the Seanon, and it was basically creating a chaotic, kind of a dark age to the point near the end of the time, which was kind of known as Dark Years, which occurred around the time just after the Void War. So, this established not only a norms of society, but also a basic of economics, law, and how the government of the entire Triad works. The first major aspect of this was, just as a general overview, let's talk a little bit about the Great Covenant. This is the central document itself, the reforms. The Great Covenant is the key set of reforms that forged the chaotic mess that was the House Senate and greater society at the time. It was penned by Empress Gwyn and then instigated by her daughter Blodwyn after she was imprisoned for years by her political enemies and rival houses. What this did is it effectively created the rules of the game that we call the Sovereign Game. This is the kind of like the Game of Thrones. It is the game that the nobles play against each other. It took what was created during the declarations we discussed previously and the listed names of the noble houses and effectively ordered them. It awarded them specific titles that they were claiming for very long, and it kind of gave them a set of rights and roles that they can claim as members of the nobility. This creates what's known as the Estates General, or the three recognized imperial castes. Alright, so let's talk about the first one. The first estate, the nobility. They were created when the powerful megacorp families wrote the Blood Declaration. This announced their names as the Blood, the houses of imperial grace, and established the foundation of the noble houses. When the Ortir was established in the Great Covenant, which changed the ranking of the houses of themselves and awarded them as tenants-in-chief to the ancestor throne. Now, the houses have a sort of a need to call themselves the Blood. This is partially because they've done so many different little augmentations to themselves that they're almost entirely a separate breed of Pharaoh. They also often, in the hour of informality, they often call themselves the Houses of Imperial Grace, and this is a reference to the fact that they are, by definition, extended members of the Imperial Royal, of the Blood Imperial. Not the Blood Royal, we have Blood Imperial here. Now, the houses are a little bit difficult to define, but as it says here in the lore, the house in Avalon is defined as three different things, depending upon who you speak to. To a noble, a house is a ruling clan or bloodline descended from an imperial blood, and their lineages are recorded on the list of names. That is how they defined it. And they tend to grade themselves into two major rankings, which are just categories for how the houses are ordered. The first and highest rank are the High Blood, or as their official name is, the Magnates of the Realm. The Magnates are made up of the Houses Sovereign, which are the families of the three imperial princes, or the three sovereign princes of the Avalon system. There's a prince of each system, so there's a Prince of Rook, a Princess of Sentinel, and a Prince of Throne. The houses greater are all the families that rule a duchy, which is effectively a planet and another planetoid, often a moon. A county, which is a singular which is a singular sector of space. A shire, which is a singular planet, and then a mark, which is more than one sector under the control of one major family. Below the magnates are the peers of the realm, and these are made up of the houses minor. Those are who rule a barony, which is a nation on a planet, or a viscounty, which is a nation within a sector. Kind of like there's a sector which is basically a chunk of space, several parsecs wide, and is home to many different little colonies, and these colonies might not necessarily be within the same general over nation. They might be within little different national groups. Then there's the house's elector, which is made up of the specifically compensated democratically elected officials of the designated prefectures or trade nations. Basically, these guys are a bit like the Hansa League, Singapore, they're effectively a trade nations, and they're recognized as such. And we'll get into this. They have a special thing known as a charter, which allows them to have this. But like how, if you play Warhammer 40k, how you have rogue traders, they're a bit like that in the context of they can exist within their own rule, and their leader gets recognized as a house elector. Then you have the houses provincial, which are made up of the ruling families of a baronetcy. A baronetcy is also known as a national province or district, and often are the cadet branches of the ruling family or families of powerful magistrates. Alright. House organization and membership. The household and the membership therein are the root of noble life. At the top is the house lord or lady, who holds the title of the family and directs the house political direction. Besides him stands his consort and his heirs or children. Beyond the rule of the house lady are the cadet branches, each ruled by their own cadet lord, who holds minor titles awarded to the family. Only the house lord can be addressed as their specific imperial title. If you are known as the Earl of a specific planet, only the house lord and his consort can be called Earl or Earlessa. Everybody else gets simply known as, if you're a great house, you're called Great Lord, and so on and so forth. You get a generic formality applied to you. All members of a given house bear the house glyph, also known as the blood mark, upon their right necks. This is a nanobot-influenced genetic adaptation, or more of a mutation, that the houses impose on themselves. All members of the house, and they actually can do this, but depending upon how they consider their inheritance, it's some weird thing that the technology of the game allows them to do. But effectively, if you are, according to what they put into the nanites, and they are passed from mother and father to child, it appears on all blood members of the house. So this makes the concept of bastards very interesting, because if you bear the blood mark, no matter what, you are a recognized member of the house. If you're illegitimate, you are a bastard, and bastards have power in this game. It's a little less confusing than Game of Thrones, but at the same time it's even more confusing because of how things work. We'll get more into them when we discuss the house specifically. Besides a noble, you often have retainers, which can make up a sort of a ruling council to assist, such as a spy master. You'll also have all non-noble errants who serve as retainers. You also might have a specific soul given who serve the family, or an arashi who is signed on to teach members of the family themselves. Now, the second estate is the clergy. This is quite common in aspects of most society. The clergy, or the clerics or priests, are often the first ruling, are often the highest caste, or often the second caste. Now, the second estate is a little confusing because there is a very, very broad term of religion in the context of Avalon. There are many religions. Some of them are not liked, some of them are well liked, some of them are simply tolerated. Every planet and colony in the Triad has created some form of mythos about the world their ancestors came from. Over time, that belief, plus the advent of advanced technology such as the Sysnet, the creation of synthetic life, and the arrival of the Voidkin, cults and revelations and much more have forged wars in the shadows. So powerful at one time was the Silver Seer of the Throne System and basically the Silver Seer was able to upend the nobility of other systems and have them killed, which created problems because he was interfering with the rule of places he probably shouldn't be touching. This guy's the equivalent of the Pope, those of you who are curious. This thus established one of the major aspects of the Great Covenant, which is known as the Ban of Gwyn, which sets forth three main tenets. The faithful are barred from raising large militias and from planning assassinations or owning chevaliers. So, effectively, the nobility can have a small defense force. They cannot plan assassinations, which seems kind of like a silly prohibition, but it's more of a legal matter of, like, suit and as a basis to, like, take out people you don't like, so you have a legal basis for it, and they cannot directly own chevaliers. Okay? The faithful might not form secondary organizations or unduly influence the noble. Now, the secondary organization is strange because there are still noble sects and orders throughout the entire Triad. What the Great Covenant does in this place is kind of create a paradox which effectively is not necessarily enforced. What they cannot do, though, is they cannot create a secondary organization that comes to rival any of the specific governmental bodies. They can have sects or divisions of their religion, they can have holy orders, but they can't found a group that takes over and rules a planet. They can't found a group that takes over and produces certain things which are controlled by the guilds, which we'll get into eventually. The third prohibition is the faithful may only defend themselves. They may not make war on other faiths. So they can only defend their places, which again is kind of vague and has been used to still commit assassination and kill others of the faith as a means of attack. But in general, they can only defend themselves. They can't make war actively on other faith. Now, the nobles often have ignored this, and what they often do is the nobility, which actually now do control the religions, control it, and then they will use the religion to fire up the populace, and then they themselves go to war, and then will get more support from their local populace or other members of their local of their faith in their foreign areas as a means of creating guerrilla combat. So effectively, we've moved from the time of the Crusades to the time of modern day holy war, as we see in the modern world with groups such as Daesh or ISIS, using social media and other means of taking out those you don't like. So this is a factor in war. You can use religion via the internet in this game as a means of affecting other adherents of your religion to effectively overthrow people you don't like. So for those of you who like conspiracies, here you go. Now let's discuss the major recognized religions. The major are a little bit complicated, but here we go. You have the faithful major, which are the Silver Creed and Duxianity. Now, this is a little biased because the other religions are actually quite large, but these are the two main religions that the Triad has decided to solely recognize as the main religions, which is silly. Then you have the faithful minor, which is made up of the Jade Path, which is an aesthetic religion, the Thousandfold, and then the final one is the Spider Cults, and then you also have the Infernal Houses. Now, one group not mentioned right now, which will be added after this podcast, is a final religion known as Itzkachana, and it is our invading religion. And because it's not necessarily directly in the Triad, it makes sense why it's not directly mentioned in the Religions of Avalon, it's mentioned in the Religions of Avalon article, but it's not directly mentioned in the System article because the Itzkachana are their separate people. They have their own little empire, and they exist outside of the Triad in general. Now, the third estate is the Commoners. Commoners are the backbone and the lifeblood of the Triad Society, from lowly synthetic labelers to the farmers that work the fields of the local settlement. Everyone plays their part in the greater scope. Society in the Triad is only slightly universal, with the third estate being quite different across each planet and nations that exist within the Triad. Some systems will have serf classes, some do not have serfs, some have semi-landed noble gentry, some of them are near communist in how things are run. So, however, there is kind of a breakdown of four general kind of classes within the commoners that are kind of recognized. You have the soldier, a class that arose to prominence in the Third Dynasty. The soldier represents the professional fighters and warriors that often support the errant class in battle. So guys, so the people we often see in carapace armor, walkers, or basically the house guard. These guys are the professional military class that has arisen to defend the warrior class in battle. These are the assistants. They're often sometimes known as they're not called squires, but they are often called footmen. There is sort of a nobility and fighting for your house in battle. The artisan is the second recognized class of the commoner or the third estate. The feudal state has not diminished the need for high scholars and builders. Many of the greatest meisters and rights of the modern era began as lowly students training in a given art. The guilds are often controlled and ran by members of the noble houses, but at the same time they need people to build and help design things. This is the basis for the artisan class. Now, the next group are the merchants, which again plays back into it. These are one of the more questionable, and they're often deemed necessary for trade, but at times the rising power of merchant families, which specifically in areas such as as we'll get into the prefectures, are the free cities, often causes problems. This is especially interesting since we have entire houses that control mercantile empires, who often actually help create these families as a means of pressuring their enemy houses, or as a means of increasing the power of their financial, holdings. The final group is basically the worker class. They are our serfs or servants, and they're kind of our throwaway red shirts, if you will. I hate to say this, but they're effectively the working man blue-collar class. They work in the industry, they help build ships, they help crew things, they help they're the lowest of the low. They're your average working class, poor people, and they're basically the ones that are going to get ground most under the feet of the nobility when it comes to this game. Now, we're going to discuss the next of the fourth estate, which is very interesting because there's technically only 3 estates, but the fourth estate was effectively added unofficially as a means to recognize power that exists outside of the empire. So, a strange thing to have foreigners, but they do in fact exist within the Empire. You don't say, lore. Years ago, when the first expansion era brought about the foundation of the Starborn peoples, many fled about the Triad and into the marches. These are the large Kuiper belts and asteroid belts that exist outside, and there's even further into what are known as the reaches, the north and southern reaches. This, and plus the advent of powerful groups calling themselves the Pretender Barons or Pretender Houses, basically founded what we know as the cartels, which are kind of these large-scale criminal organizations. And also groups like the Corsairs. And this effectively has created what we call the foreign or criminal houses. Yes, there are criminal houses. Okay. If you are a non-Triad power, but you're often a polity that can at least that of a major family, you're known as a house foreigner, or the house's foreigner. Houses colonial, which are much smaller colonies or smaller clusters of colonies that effectively exist outside this. So basically, if you're a major non-Triad polity, you're ruled by a house foreigner. If you're a smaller, minor, or subjugate polity, you're known as a house colonial. If you're basically a corsair or a semi-noble state, you're often recognized as a house privateer. There is also another group known as pretender houses, which are often groups of former bloodlines or criminal enterprises that play up being nobility. So, for years, if not plenty, there existed the so-called pretender barons who ruled portions of the Triad. These individuals were far from legitimate nobility or even elected rulers. They're not even oligarchs, but criminals who have risen to power through the various underhanded means. Most, if not all, these individuals are stereotypically starborn, or those who dwell in the space colonies. Truth is that most of the pretender houses control silent networks, or the cartels, or illegal trade and crime across the Triad. The Corsairs, on the other hand, are often stereotypically shipborne and have carved up independent fleets in pirate havens in the Marcher zones. Most of the Corsairs are notorious for being vicious and skilled in navigating the dangerous vast asteroid fields of the Marches. The skill in ship combat is perhaps the greatest skill of the Corsairs, as many of them show a almost prescient ability to predict the flow of the star winds and the movement of gravitational forces. Starborn are scary in space. Just remember, not Starborn, shipborn are scary in space. Starborn are just really good at surviving in space, but Shipborn take it to a whole new level. They're the Star Elves, if anyone is ever curious. Okay. Most of the Corsair and Pretender houses are often organized in a similar, almost kind of a perverted or kind of a counter fashion, a sort of allegorical form of the noble houses. They even have retainers and a ruling bloodline, so the clannish nature of the Feyre appears even among the criminal elements of the Triad. Now, and they also will even have standing league or alliances with noble houses. Of course, the noble houses would totally ally with Corsairs and evil people just so they can get more power. Makes sense. Not that all criminals are evil people. Some of these people were just simply screwed by the nobles, who themselves are pretty evil in some level. Yeah, I just made a grimdark comment there. This is still not 40k people. Anyway, outside of the different estates, we're going to talk quickly about the concept of multilingualism before we jump into the government of the Triad. So, there are 4 recognized general languages across the Triad, and the thing to make note is that the peoples of the Avalon are varied and diverse, leading to a variety of languages or tongues spoken across the vastness of the Triad. This is also incorporating the fact that there are languages spoken beyond the Triad, but the Triad will never really care about that. So, there are dozens. There's not more than dozens. There's hundreds. This happens because the Feyre once don't get along, and because it's kind of hard to create a very accurate translation matrix, and also because the nobles kind of purposely discourage multilingualism on some levels because it allows them to retain a level of control on their local populace. It encourages also national identity, which is again how they keep control. There are 4 major recognized languages. There's Elder Tongue, which is a scholarly language spoken by the ancestors and now exists as the language of the noble terminology, debate, and other religious scripture of the major faiths. The Curmvine of the Silver Creed is written in Elder Tongue. High Avalonic, which is the language of the entire noble class, and this is because reasons. I think it's mostly because effectively Throne is full of itself on some level, and the nobles went with it. But let's just say it's because of the prime. It's probably mostly because I really don't know. I think it's because Throne is just that influential from that long of time. It's also being kept by the current one of the major noble sovereign families that exist, being a Avalonic family. Anyway, it's also a major trade language of the Triad. You have Duza, which is the primary tongue of Duzok and a distant cousin of the languages of Aru. Duza is now currently a reigning language of science. It's also the current reigning language of science, and this is probably because Duzok has a lot of influences on scholarly recording. Cyrus the Elder is one of the greatest scholars and historians of known Avalonic history. And also because there was some weird stuff done on Duzok that probably is against the laws of nature, and we're not going to go into that until we have more lore on it. Finally, you have Akanis, which is the primacy of House Amaterasu over House Iran of Anun, led to the plethora of Yomijin culture spreading across the Triad. It is also the major tongue of the Jade Dragon Masters of Boa, which is a current terminology for combat, and also swordsmanship. So effectively, Avalonic is the term we often use when it comes to trade or noble terms. Duzok often influences concepts such as science, more dealing with biology and that kind of design. And then Akanis is where we get a lot of our combat and our dueling terms. So, let's talk a little bit about translation and multilingualism. Most nobility and clergy speak at least 2 languages, if not more, because, honestly, if you do not speak one of these 3 languages, you're probably kind of screwed as a noble. It's also pretty silly not to speak your more than one language, because people will run circles around you if you can't read a contract correctly. Houses, in turn, often encourage, again, as we said, they often encourage local populaces to enforce loyalty to the ruling bloodline. Now, let's quickly discuss the government of the Triad. First, let's just acknowledge that the Triad's government and bureaucracy, which is known as the Imperial Bureaucracy, is more than complicated. It has its own little subsystem of rule, and there's not enough time to even remotely cover that, so we're just going to quickly discuss what a charter is. The power nations can be quite convoluted on some levels, with entire planets existing in a multitude of varieties of strange system of categories that sprung up. These are based upon a series of official designations known as charters. A charter is an age-old document seal and often kept with a near sacred relevance as the basis of colonial settlement. These charters have over time been altered as new governments arose throughout the Triad. This means that charters are often edited and updated digitally over time and often maintained with sovereign records. The so-called prefectures, as I mentioned before, the House's electorate, they exist as a special charter because the House Senate said, it'd probably be a good idea to have a free trade zone. We don't know why, but our friends funding us think it's a good idea. Bam. Okay, so the center of all government, because the Ancestor Throne no longer has an emperor, is the Seinon, also known as the Thwal Seinon in Elder Tongue, literally translating as the Blood Senate or the Tribal Senate. It is also known in High Avalonic, aka English as we speak it, as as the House Senate, and it is just honestly called the Seinon. That is S with a little E with a little thing over it, N-A-N-N, Seinon, for those of you who want to understand what the heck that is pronounced as. It evolved from the Imperial Senate of the First Era, and has basically been running the Triad ever since. It can pass executive authority, and it effectively has a voting system. There are two primary houses, legislative houses. There's the system's triumvirate, which is made up of the three sovereign princes themselves, who basically can vote, and they can create legislation and laws as they see fit. And below the triumvirate stands the system's tribunate, which is made up of the lords of the great houses. The minor houses do get a ruling tribune, what are known as popular tribunes, and that's it. The houses each get one vote. They can put things to the floor, various other little acts and bills and little determinations. Basically, it's not only the legislative body, it is the judgmental body. So effectively, there is no executor. There is only a legislator. The executive, judicial, and a legislative branch are one thing. It's the ruling council of billions of people. You can see why there are problems with it. Now, there is political division in the government. These powers are often ruling blocks or voting things are often related by bloodline or various little philosophies known as high orders. There are three general high orders. We will discuss them eventually when we start talking about the Entantes, which are these kind of voting parties or caucuses. They often vote with each other, and is a reason why some groups often win and why some others don't, and why some houses have historically allied with each other. So, that's enough for government. Let's talk a little bit about economics, because you guys need to know what economics in the Triad is about. So, the core of Avalon in the exchange, which is controlled by the Imperial Central Bank, the ICB, is the currency known as the Avalonic Imperial Torque, or ATI, which basically stands for Avalonic Torque Imperial, or Torque. These little things look like little golden half rings, or about the size of a quarter, roughly, give or take, depending on who makes them. Again, chaos is beloved by the Pharaoh. Okay, it has been maintained for several centuries, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it, but somehow the ICB is just magical when it comes to controlling currency. Those who have been able to slowly disappear or slowly become employed by the bank are the only ones who even have attempted to get away with counterfeiting it. So, the saying in the bank is all for the good of the empire, and it comes to protecting the integrity of the Avalonic economy. If there has been one serious constant in the entire imperial history, it has been the Imperial Bank, which is not really that hard to imagine. It's the center of money, and money makes the universe and the Avalon cluster run. So, most of these little things are often exchanged digitally, and they are exchanged via what are known as a personal VN, which is a virtual network of a user's account. And then you can often use what's known as a credit chit to buy things. So it's like a credit card. And there are some physical currency. This is kind of an odd thing to do, kind of an eccentricity. And these are often, again, small golden half rings, and they're always inscribed with the word Athelon, or Avalon in Elder Tongue. And generally, physical currency or payment is only reserved for those who dwell on agrarian or more primitive worlds, or in other cases, the ritualistic or traditional types will quite regularly require such payments as a mean of showing honor. Because you can hack, you can hack the internet, but you can't really hack money, and you can see them stealing, and you can't counterfeit the damn thing, so, yeah, a little bit easier. Still discussing economics, we're going to talk quickly about a group simply known as the Guilds. So, not the Guilds from Guild Wars, guys, or the Spacing Guild, though the Spacing Guild of Dune did seriously have an influence on it. The Guilds are kind of they're the resurgence of the mega corporations, but they're more of a loose confederation of masters or people who produce things in industry, and then what they did is they gathered all together everybody of a like-minded industry and regulated it within themselves. So they're the ones who control the economy. They control the graphs of the power of production facilities and resources is within the nobility, but then the nobility through membership or suspense can only really produce things with everything that is learned by the guilds. The guilds are the ones who can actually make things and know what to do with things. And so they have created these kind of powerful multi-house of corporations that keep certain technologies and monopolies constant. The most prominent of these are often the three primary guilds known as the alchemists, which are the ones who control most biological, medical, and other technologies relating to anything organic. Then you have the Meisters, who are the ones who create the Soul Given, and finally the Rights, who often make a lot of the weaponry and develop the Chevaliers. Another major guild, which is a primary force, which also creates many different weapons, is the Reavers Guild. They're the ones who often come in and deal with Guagara infections and other monstrosities that might threaten the Triad. There's also other guilds, which are not mentioned in the general lore documents, such as the Artificers Guild, which are the ones who create the ships. So generally, every major industry in the universe of Land and Stars has its own guild and its own set of regulations that relate to it. Guilds are often highly chaotic and far from united. Membership is a means of training personally with an established member. Those who undergo their journeymanship are then able to attain the rank of master and found their own independent practice. Alright, let's talk a little bit about law and order. The working of law within the Triad is conducted along varying levels of bureaucratic complexity and at times can seem quite insane. Above all rests the law laid down by the Slainte, or this is basically Imperial law. If the law is created by the Slainte, it is Imperial law. The next level of law is systems law, which is the law created by what are known as the systems councils, or basically the groups of nobles and their ruling prince who decide what kind of law affects the entire system. Then you have what is known as planetary or sector law, which is basically the law specifically laid out by a great house, and the national law, which is the one created by the House Minor or the House Elector. The basics of Imperial law is, again, complicated because it's kind of separated into different little categories. These are kind of known as these are the generally grand tenets or keystone aspects of the law. Again, kind of going a little bit back to Magna Carta here, what kind of sets down what rights. So, let's discuss the grand tenets. The first one is the laws of war. The laws of war establish that two houses may go to war with proper declaration within the Slainte. Once a writ of few is given, the two forces may conduct battle as they see fit. Mass killing of civilian populations and destruction of arable land is in general forbidden. You want to kill the enemy, not create lots of death, because people and land are worth lots of money and power. That's kind of the thinking behind this. The laws of blood. These are the laws laid out in the Ortier that discuss the rights and restrictions of the nobility. They include the establishment of the mark system and the means a house is able to gain power and usurp of others through political gaming. That is the one that tells the houses these are the rules of the Game of Thrones, and if you break it, we will kill you. Yes, they do execute people for breaking that law. The laws of faith. The laws of faith are part of the greater tenets laid out in the Ban and Gwyn. These include the limitations of arm that a house's faithful may carry, and also the establishment of the clerical charters, which we will discuss in the future. Then there's the laws of commons. The basic law of all establish the rights and the abilities of the commoner class, which is kind of like a Bill of Rights on a very limited scale. Basically says a noble can't necessarily execute an entire family for, not serving them the right tea. There is kind of a limitation to how crazy executionary you can get as a noble. Alright. Enforcement of the law is where things get a little dicey, which is kind of saying a lot, since a lot of this world this universe is quite dicey. The power to judge and enforce the law resides within the court of the ruling feudal lord. In some nations, this can be quite different, and the lord in question assigns a series of independent judiciaries to judge the actions of someone as innocent or guilty. You don't necessarily get a judge. You might just get a ruling noble who says, "I hate you, you die." You may get a jury who actually listens to things. You may actually get an advocate. You may not get an advocate. It is all at the discretion of the local house lord, which kind of sucks. The actual enforcement, therefore, of a crime is decided based upon the fief or mens in which it occurs. Basically, if you go to a place that has really restrictive law, pay attention. If you go to a place that's very open, you're fine. But don't get too crazy, because, again, imperial law and systems and planetary supersedes the law of some backwater nation, which often creates a lot of jurisdiction disputes and feuds. In either case, if it is a house-appointed police, or who will then be appointed to act as the enforcers of a given region. Imprisonment itself is often quite simple, albeit some plans are far more brutal in how a criminal or an often accused is punished. The ideal of innocence till proven guilty is often rare in many states, and even then the accused, if they are connected, can sometimes even circumvent a judge if they know or are a member of a more powerful house. Thank you, cronyism. Welcome to the Triad, everybody, and thank you to listening to tonight's episode on the Imperial Society. The next two episodes we'll be discussing the nobility specifically, and then we'll do a overview series on the general religions, and then if we have time we'll do a separate discussion on the religions themselves, as we are still currently developing lore on technology. Everybody, please, thank you for your listening tonight. If you have time, please subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments, or send them to an email at shadowedsin@gmail.com, or tweet me at shadowed_sin on Twitter. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice day. And as the Amazons say, Vehenshush, spirits to you.